She was only 8 years old when she disappeared into the Montana wilderness 3 days before Christmas. Everyone in Pine Ridge thought they would find her body frozen in the snow. But what little Kate Morrison discovered deep in those woods was not just shelter from the storm. It was a cabin frozen in time, untouched for nearly 50 years, holding secrets of love, loss, and a woman who died waiting for a soldier who never came home. This is the true story of how getting lost led to the most miraculous discovery of all. The December wind bit hard across Pine Ridge, Montana, carrying with it the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones and does not let go. It was the 22nd of December 2019, and the town sat quiet beneath a gray sky that promised snow. The kind of snow that came fast and heavy. The kind old-timers watched with worried eyes and tight lips. Kate Morrison stood at the window of the small rental house on Maple Street. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched the bare branches of the elm tree sway in the wind. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and eyes the color of storm clouds. Her father said she had her mother's eyes. He did not say it often anymore. Talking about her mother hurt too much. The house was quiet except for the hum of the old furnace struggling to keep up with the cold. Christmas decorations sat in a box in the corner of the living room, untouched. Last year, they had not decorated at all. The year before that, her mother had been alive, and the house had been full of light and music and the smell of sugar cookies baking in the oven. Kate remembered it like a dream now, distant and soft around the edges. Her mother, Anna, had loved Christmas more than anyone Kate had ever known. She had loved the lights, the carols, the magic of it all. She used to say Christmas was when the world remembered how to hope. 2 years ago, 3 days after Christmas, Anna Morrison died in a car accident on the icy road between Pine Ridge and Helena. She had been coming home from visiting her sister. The doctor said she did not suffer. Kate's father, David, had not been the same since. He worked double shifts at the lumber mill on the edge of town, coming home late smelling like sawdust and exhaustion. He barely spoke anymore, just moved through the house like a ghost, heating up frozen dinners and falling asleep in front of the television. Kate understood. Grief was a heavy thing. She carried it too, in the way she stopped singing, stopped drawing pictures, stopped asking for things she knew they could not afford. Money was tight. It had always been tight, but after Anna died, it got worse. Medical bills, funeral costs, the weight of everything pressing down on David until he could barely breathe. The rental house was small and drafty, with peeling wallpaper and floors that creaked. But it was home. Kate had her own room, a twin bed with a quilt her grandmother had made, and a window that looked out at the woods behind the house. Those woods had become her sanctuary. When the house felt too quiet, too sad, she would slip outside and walk among the pines, collecting things, pine cones, interesting rocks, feathers, small treasures that made her feel less alone. That afternoon, the 22nd, David left for work at noon. He kissed the top of Kate's head absently, told her to be good for Mrs. Miller, and walked out the door with his lunch pail and a tiredness that seemed to pull at his shoulders. Mrs. Miller lived next door in a yellow house with a ceramic gnome in the front yard. She was 72 years old, kind but forgetful, and she watched Kate most afternoons when David worked late. She smelled like lavender and mothballs, and she let Kate eat vanilla wafers while they watched game shows on her old television. Kate walked over at 1 o'clock, bundled in her winter coat. A hand-me-down from a church donation bin. It was too big, the sleeves hanging past her hands, but it was warm. Mrs. Miller answered the door with a smile, ushered her inside, and immediately started fussing over whether Kate had eaten lunch. She had a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, but Mrs. Miller made her hot chocolate anyway, the powdered kind that tasted like sugar and comfort. They sat together for a while watching the television, but Kate's mind wandered. She kept looking out the window at the woods. The sky was darkening, clouds rolling in low and heavy. It looked like snow, real snow. Not the dusting they had gotten a few days ago, but the kind that blanketed everything, transforming the world into something clean and new. Her mother used to take her outside during the first big snow of the year. They would catch snowflakes on their tongues and make snow angels in the yard. Kate had not made a snow angel since her mother died. At 2:30, Kate asked Mrs. Miller if she could play outside. Mrs. Miller looked up from her crossword puzzle, squinted at the window and said, "Well, I suppose, but stay in the backyard, dear. Don't wander off. Your father would have my head if something happened to you, Kate promised. She pulled on her coat, her boots, her mittens, and stepped outside into the cold. The air was sharp, biting at her cheeks, but it felt good, alive. She walked around Mrs. Miller's yard for a few minutes, then drifted toward the tree line that separated the properties from the woods. She had been in those woods 100 times, knew the trails, the clearings, the old oak tree with the initials carved into its trunk. It was not far, just a quick walk to collect some pine cones. She had seen a craft idea in a library book about making pine cone ornaments. Maybe if she made some, her father would let her decorate the tree this year. Maybe it would make him smile. The first snowflakes started falling as she stepped into the woods. They were small and delicate, drifting down like whispers. Kate tilted her head back and caught one on her tongue. It melted instantly, cold and pure. She smiled. It felt like her mother was there. Just for a moment. She walked deeper into the trees, following the familiar path, her boots crunching over frozen leaves and brittle twigs. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. No birds, no wind, just the soft sound of snow beginning to fall. She found a cluster of pine cones beneath a tall pine and knelt down, gathering them into her pockets. That is when she saw it. A flash of red among the gray and white. A cardinal, her mother's favorite bird. Anna used to say cardinals were messengers, that when you saw one, someone you loved was watching over you. Kate's heart squeezed. The cardinal hopped from branch to branch, its red feathers bright against the snow. It moved deeper into the woods, and without thinking, Kate followed. She knew she should not. Mrs. Miller had said to stay close, but the cardinal felt like a sign. Like her mother calling to her, she walked carefully, keeping her eyes on the bird as it flitted through the trees. The snow was falling harder now, thicker, the flakes no longer delicate but heavy and wet. They clung to her coat, her hair, melting against her skin. The cardinal landed on a low branch ahead, tilted its head as if waiting for her, then took off again. Kate followed. She did not notice how far she had gone until she stopped and looked around. The trees were unfamiliar, taller, denser, pressing in close. The path she had been following was gone, covered in snow. Her footprints were already disappearing, filled in by the storm that had come on faster than anyone expected. The cardinal was gone too, vanished into the white. Panic fluttered in her chest. She turned in a circle, trying to find something she recognized. But everything looked the same. Trees, snow, silence. "Hello?" she called out, her voice small and swallowed by the wind that had begun to pick up. "Mrs. Miller?" No answer, just the howl of the wind and the relentless fall of snow. Kate's breath came faster. She was not supposed to be here. She had gone too far. She tried to remember which direction she had come from, but the storm was disorienting, turning the world into a blur of white and gray. She started walking, hoping she was heading back toward home. But the trees seemed endless, and the cold was seeping through her coat. Her fingers were numb inside her mittens. Her face stung from the wind. She walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Her legs ached. Her lungs burned from the cold air. She called for help again and again, but the storm swallowed her voice. Tears froze on her cheeks. She was lost, truly lost. And the snow was coming down so hard now, she could barely see 3 feet in front of her. The temperature was dropping fast, and she was only wearing a light jacket under her coat. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Kate stumbled over a hidden root and fell hard, her hands sinking into the snow. She lay there for a moment, exhausted, terrified, wanting to give up. But then she heard her mother's voice in her head, soft and steady. "Get up, sweetheart. You're stronger than you think." Kate pushed herself to her feet, wiping snow from her face. She had to keep moving. If she stopped, if she lay down, she might not get back up. She took a shaky breath and kept walking. One foot in front of the other, through the blinding white. That is when she saw it. A dark shape through the snow, low and solid. At first she thought it was just a cluster of trees or a large rock, but as she got closer, her heart leapt. It was a cabin. A small log cabin, half buried in snow. vines crawling up its sides like the forest had been trying to reclaim it for years. The windows were dark, no light, no smoke from the chimney. Thick snow sat undisturbed on the porch. No footprints, no signs of life. Kate hesitated. She had been taught not to go into strangers' houses. But this did not look like anyone lived here. It looked abandoned, forgotten. And she was so cold her teeth were chattering, her whole body shaking. She had to get out of the storm. She climbed the 2 steps to the porch, her boots breaking through the crusty snow. The front door was slightly ajar, the wood swollen and warped from years of weather. She pushed it gently, and it creaked open, groaning like something waking from a long sleep. Kate stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind her with a heavy thud, muffling the roar of the storm. The sudden silence was almost shocking. She stood in the darkness, breathing hard, listening. Nothing. No sounds. No movement. Just the faint whistle of wind through cracks in the walls. The cabin smelled old, like dust and wood and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers. Kate's hands shook as she reached into her coat pocket. She had taken a box of matches from Mrs. Miller's kitchen earlier that week when they had lit candles during a brief power outage. She had meant to return them but forgot. Now she was grateful. She struck a match and the small flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the dim light, she saw a candle sitting on a small table near the door. She lit it carefully, and the room began to reveal itself. The cabin was small, just one room, but it was intact. A stone fireplace stood against the far wall, a stack of wood beside it, neatly arranged. There was a bed in the corner, covered with a faded quilt. A wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the window. Shelves lined one wall, filled with jars and books and small objects Kate could not quite make out. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but nothing was broken. Nothing was disturbed. It was like someone had walked out one day and never came back, and time had simply stopped. Kate moved deeper into the cabin, holding the candle in front of her. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but they felt solid. She set the candle on the table and looked around, her fear slowly being replaced by wonder. This place was frozen in time, untouched, waiting. She saw a photograph on the mantel above the fireplace and walked over to it. The frame was tarnished, the glass dusty, but she could make out the image. A man in a military uniform, young and handsome, standing tall with a serious expression. Beside it was another photo. The same man, older with a woman. They were smiling, standing in front of this very cabin. The woman had kind eyes and long hair pulled back in a braid. Kate wondered who they were, where they had gone, why they had left everything behind. She shivered, realizing she was still freezing. The storm was raging outside, the wind howling like a living thing. She looked at the fireplace, at the stack of wood beside it. She had watched her father start fires before. She thought she could do it. She knelt down and carefully arranged some of the smaller pieces of wood in the fireplace, then wadded up an old piece of newspaper she found in a basket nearby. The paper was yellowed and brittle, dated July 1972, 47 years ago. Kate's hands trembled as she struck another match and held it to the paper. It caught instantly, flames licking at the edges, spreading to the kindling. Within minutes, a fire was crackling in the hearth, and warmth began to spread through the small space. Kate sat back on her heels, watching the flames dance. She felt a small sense of accomplishment, of survival. She was okay for now. She was okay. She pulled off her wet mittens and held her hands toward the fire, feeling the numbness slowly fade. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up. She could hear the wind battering the cabin, snow piling up against the walls. She knew she could not leave tonight. She would have to wait until morning. Wait until the storm passed. The thought terrified her, but the warmth of the fire gave her courage. She stood and explored the cabin more carefully. There was a small pantry area with a few sealed jars, their contents unidentifiable in the dim light. A kettle hung on a hook near the fireplace. The bed looked old, but clean, the quilt hand-stitched with a pattern of stars. Kate touched it gently. It was soft, well made. She wondered if the woman in the photograph had made it. She sat down on the edge of the bed, exhaustion crashing over her. She was so tired, so scared, and so far from home. Back in Pine Ridge, Mrs. Miller had just woken from a nap. She sat up in her recliner, blinking at the clock. 4:30. She looked around, confused. Where was Kate? She walked to the back door and looked out. The snow was coming down hard, the backyard already covered. No sign of the little girl. Mrs. Miller's heart began to race. She pulled on her coat and boots and stepped outside, calling Kate's name. The wind tore the words from her mouth. She walked around the yard, then to the edge of the woods, panic rising in her chest. No footprints. The snow had covered everything. She rushed back inside and grabbed the phone with shaking hands. Dialing David's number at the mill, it rang 4 times before he answered, his voice tired. "David, it's Dorothy Miller. I cannot find Kate." There was a long pause, then David's voice, sharp and terrified. "What do you mean you cannot find her?" "She asked to play outside and I said yes, but now she is gone in the snow. Oh God, David, I am so sorry." David did not wait to hear more. He slammed the phone down and ran. He told his supervisor there was an emergency and sprinted to his truck, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Not Kate, not his little girl. He could not lose her too. He could not survive that. He drove too fast through the snow-covered streets, his truck fishtailing as he turned onto Maple Street. He screeched to a stop in front of Mrs. Miller's house and jumped out, not bothering to close the door. Mrs. Miller was standing on the porch, wringing her hands, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, David. I fell asleep. I did not mean to." She said she would stay close. David did not respond. He was already moving toward the woods, shouting Kate's name. The snow was blinding, the wind vicious. He could barely see his own hands in front of his face. He stumbled into the tree line, calling for her over and over, his voice raw and desperate. But there was nothing, just the storm and his own fear echoing back at him. Mrs. Miller called the sheriff's department, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. Within 15 minutes, 2 deputies arrived, their lights cutting through the white. Sheriff Tom Hayes was with them, a man in his late 50s who had lived in Pine Ridge his whole life. He knew these woods, knew how unforgiving they could be in winter. He also knew David Morrison, knew about Anna's death, knew the man had already suffered more than anyone should. They organized quickly. More volunteers arrived, neighbors, mill workers, people who had heard the call go out over the radio. They formed search teams dividing the woods into sections. But the storm was making it nearly impossible. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees and was still falling. The wind chill made it feel like 0. If Kate was out there without proper shelter, without warmth, she would not last the night. David refused to stop searching. He pushed deeper into the woods, his flashlight beam swallowed by the snow. His hands were numb, his face burned from the cold, but he did not care. He had to find her. He had to. Every terrible thought he had been trying to push away came flooding in. Images of Kate lost, scared, crying for him. Images of her small body frozen in the snow. Images of another funeral, another casket, another unbearable loss. He fell to his knees in the snow, sobbing, the weight of it all crushing him. He had failed. He had been so buried in his own grief, so absent, that he had not protected the one thing that mattered most, his daughter, his little girl who looked at him with her mother's eyes and never complained, never asked for anything, just tried to be small and invisible because she thought that was what he needed. Sheriff Hayes found him there and pulled him to his feet. "David, we are going to find her, but you need to stay strong. She needs you strong." David nodded, wiping his face with frozen hands. They kept searching, but as night fell and the storm raged on, hope began to fade. The search teams regrouped at the Morrison house, standing in the living room, tracking snow across the floor, their faces grim. They had covered miles of woods and found nothing. No sign of Kate, no footprints, no clothing, nothing. Sheriff Hayes made the call to bring in more resources. State police, search and rescue with dogs, helicopters if the storm cleared by morning. But everyone knew what the odds were. A small child, underdressed, lost in a blizzard, temperatures below freezing. The chances of survival dropped with every passing hour. Mrs. Miller sat in her kitchen crying, praying, blaming herself. David sat at his own kitchen table, staring at nothing, his mind replaying every moment he should have been there, should have done better, should have been a better father. The town of Pine Ridge held its breath. Christmas lights blinked in windows, but there was no joy in them. Just a desperate hope that somehow, by some miracle, little Kate Morrison would be found alive. Miles away, deep in the woods, in a cabin no one had entered in nearly 50 years, Kate lay curled beneath a quilt by the fire, exhausted and scared, but alive. The flames crackled softly. The storm howled outside, and in the silence of that forgotten place, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer her mother had taught her. Please let them find me. Please keep me safe. Please. The cabin held her gently, a shelter built by hands long turned to dust, warmed by a fire that should not have been possible, preserved by time and something that felt almost like grace. Kate did not know it yet, but she was not alone. The spirit of this place, the love that had soaked into its walls, the hope that had been planted here decades ago. It was still here, still waiting, still holding on. And tomorrow, when the sun rose and the storm finally broke, the real story would begin to unfold. Kate woke with a start, her body stiff and cold despite the dying embers in the fireplace. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The woods, the storm, the cabin. She sat up slowly, her muscles aching from sleeping, curled on the hard floor near the hearth. The candle had burned down to nothing, but pale gray light filtered through the dusty windows. Morning, she had survived the night. The storm had quieted, no more howling wind, no more battering against the walls, just an eerie silence that felt heavy and watchful. Kate stood and walked to the window, wiping away a circle of grime with her sleeve. What she saw made her stomach drop. Snow everywhere. The world outside had been transformed into a white wasteland. Drifts rose halfway up the cabin walls. Trees bowed under the weight of it. The sky was still gray, threatening more. She was buried out here, miles from home, and no one knew where she was. Her throat tightened with fear, but she pushed it down. Crying would not help. She needed to think. She needed to survive. She turned back to the cabin, really looking at it now in the daylight. The fireplace was made of river stone, carefully fitted together. Above it hung an old oil lamp, its glass chimney clouded with age. The mantel was simple pine, hand-carved with delicate scrollwork along the edges. Someone had taken great care building this place. Someone had loved it. Kate's eyes moved to the photographs she had noticed the night before. 3 of them, arranged in silver frames that had tarnished to nearly black. She walked closer, studying them in the morning light. The first showed a young man in military dress uniform, his cap set at a precise angle, his jaw strong, his eyes looking directly at the camera with a mixture of pride and something else. Fear, maybe, or determination. The photograph was black and white, slightly faded, but his face was clear, handsome in a quiet, serious way. The second photograph showed the same man, older now, maybe late 20s, standing beside a woman. They were in front of this cabin. That much was obvious. The logs looked newer, the windows bright, the porch freshly built. The man had his arm around the woman's shoulders, and they were both smiling. The kind of smile that comes from deep happiness. The woman was beautiful, with long dark hair pulled back, wearing a simple dress that the wind pressed against her legs. Her hand rested on the man's chest, and even in the faded photograph, Kate could see the ring on her finger. The third photograph was of the woman alone. She stood in the same spot in front of the cabin, but the image had a different quality. She was not smiling. Her face was calm but sad, her eyes looking past the camera towards something distant. She wore a heavy sweater, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. There was something about her posture, the way she held herself, that spoke of waiting, of hoping, of refusing to give up. Kate felt a strange connection to this woman, as if they were linked across time by something she could not name. Loss, maybe. Loneliness. The understanding that sometimes the people you love most are the ones you cannot reach. She touched the glass of the third photograph gently, leaving a small fingerprint in the dust. "Who were you?" she whispered. The cabin offered no answer, but Kate's curiosity pulled her deeper. She moved to the shelves against the wall and examined them more carefully. Mason jars filled with preserved vegetables, their contents long past safe to eat, books with cracked spines and water-stained covers, a wooden box filled with buttons, a collection of pine cones arranged by size, small treasures that spoke of a life lived simply, carefully, with attention to detail. On the lowest shelf, Kate found something that made her pause, a leather-bound book, about the size of a school notebook, its cover worn smooth by handling. She pulled it out carefully and opened it. The pages were yellowed but intact, covered in handwriting so beautiful it looked like art, cursive letters flowing across the lines in deep blue ink. At the top of the first page, a name and a date, Elizabeth Ann Sullivan, March 3rd, 1968. Kate's heart beat faster. This was a journal, a diary. She carried it to the table and sat down, opening it to the first entry. The handwriting was steady, hopeful. Today, Robert and I moved into our cabin. It took us 6 months to build, working every weekend, every spare hour. My hands are covered in blisters and my back aches, but I have never been happier. This place is ours, truly ours. Robert says when he comes back from his deployment, this is where we will start our life together. We will fill it with children and laughter and love. I told him I would wait here forever if I had to. He kissed me and said, "You will not have to wait long, Beth, I promise." Kate read slowly, carefully, drawn into Elizabeth's world. The entries continued, each one a window into a life that had been lived in this very room. Elizabeth wrote about teaching at the Pine Ridge Elementary School, about her students, about the kindness of the townspeople who brought her firewood and food. She wrote about missing Robert, about the letters he sent from Vietnam, about her fear and her faith. She wrote about decorating the cabin for Christmas, about hanging a wreath on the door, about waiting for the day he would come home. Entry after entry, Kate watched hope slowly transform into something darker. The letters from Robert stopped coming in August of 1969. Elizabeth wrote about the waiting, the not knowing, the officials who came to tell her he was missing in action. She wrote about refusing to believe he was gone, about keeping the cabin exactly as it was the day he left, about her certainty that he would find his way back to her. Kate turned the pages, her eyes burning. The entries grew shorter, more desperate. Elizabeth wrote about the townspeople trying to convince her to move into town, to accept a teaching position that would give her a steady place to live. She refused. She wrote, "If Robert comes home and I am not here, how will he find me? This cabin is our promise. I will not break it." The dates jumped. Months would pass between entries. Elizabeth's handwriting became shakier. The ink sometimes smudged as if by tears. She wrote about her garden failing, about the loneliness of winter, about seeing Robert in her dreams. She wrote about conversations with him as if he were still there, still sitting in the chair by the fire, still promising to come home. Kate reached the final pages, and her hands trembled. The last entry was dated December 20th, 1976, 43 years ago, almost to the day. The handwriting was barely legible, the letters thin and spidery. "I know I will not see another spring. The cold has settled into my bones, and I have not the strength to fight it anymore. But I am not afraid. If Robert comes home, he will look for me here. He will find this journal. He will know I waited. He will know I kept my promise. I pray someone finds this place someday and understands that love does not end just because time does. This cabin holds every hope we ever had, every dream. I have left it all here for him, for us. And if he never comes, then at least we had this. At least we had our cabin in the woods where we were going to grow old together." The entry ended there. No signature, no farewell, just silence. Kate closed the journal carefully, tears streaming down her face. Elizabeth had died here, alone, one, waiting for a man who never came home. She died in this cabin, probably in that bed, holding on to hope until her very last breath. And no one had known. The town had forgotten her. The world had moved on, but this place had held her memory, sealed and preserved, waiting for someone to find it. Kate looked around the cabin with new eyes. This was not just shelter. It was a tomb, a monument, a love letter written in wood and stone and stubborn faith. She wiped her tears and stood, feeling like she should do something. Acknowledge Elizabeth's story somehow. Honor it. She walked to the bed and gently touched the quilt, realizing Elizabeth had probably made it herself, had probably sewn each star with her own hands while waiting for Robert. Beneath the bed, Kate noticed a trunk, old and wooden with brass hinges. She pulled it out carefully, half expecting it to be locked. But the latch opened easily. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, were Christmas decorations. Kate lifted them out one by one, her heart aching. A small ceramic nativity set, hand-painted, each figure delicate and perfect. Strings of wooden beads stained deep red and green, handmade ornaments crafted from pine cones and ribbon, a star made of twisted wire and dried flowers. Elizabeth had been preparing for Christmas, even in her final days, even knowing she was dying. She had still hoped, still believed he might come home. Kate set the nativity scene on the mantel, arranging the tiny figures with trembling hands. Mary and Joseph, the baby in the manger, the shepherds and wise men. She placed a candle beside it, one of the few remaining in the cabin, and lit it with a match. The small flame flickered, casting dancing shadows across the holy scene. "I understand," Kate whispered to the empty room, to Elizabeth's spirit if it was still here. "I understand waiting for someone who will not come back. I wait for my mom every day. I know she is not coming, but I still wait." The cabin seemed to breathe around her, the logs settling, the wind sighing through the cracks. For a moment, Kate felt less alone, like Elizabeth was there, invisible but present. Two souls separated by decades, but connected by the same kind of loss, the same kind of love that does not know how to let go. Kate's stomach growled, pulling her back to practical matters. She was hungry, thirsty. She needed to figure out how to survive another day. She searched the pantry area more thoroughly, finding a tin of crackers that was stale but sealed, a jar of honey that had crystallized but was still good. She used snow melted in the kettle over the fire to make water, drinking it slowly, savoring the warmth. She rationed the crackers, eating just a few, not knowing how long she would be here. The day stretched long and quiet. Kate kept the fire going, feeding it wood from the stack beside the hearth. She read more of Elizabeth's journal, going back to the beginning, learning about the woman who had lived and died in this place. She learned that Elizabeth had been 24 when she married Robert, that they had met in high school, that he had proposed on the 4th of July beneath fireworks. She learned that Elizabeth loved poetry, that she collected leaves and pressed them in books, that she believed in pollen and fate and the power of promises kept to her. Kate found herself talking to Elizabeth as if she were there. "Did you teach second grade? I am in third. My teacher's name is Mrs. Morrison. She is nice, but she does not smile much. My mom used to volunteer in my class. She would help with reading groups and art projects. I miss that." She paused, staring into the fire. "I miss her all the time. Dad misses her too, but he will not talk about it. He just works and pretends everything is fine. But it is not fine. Nothing is fine." The confession hung in the air, and Kate felt lighter for having said it. She curled up in the chair near the fire, wrapping herself in Elizabeth's quilt, and let herself cry. Not the scared crying from last night, but deep, heavy sobs that came from the center of her chest, from the place where all her grief lived. She cried for her mother, for her father's sadness, for Elizabeth and Robert, for all the people who love each other and get torn apart by things they cannot control. Outside, the day faded into evening. The gray sky darkened to charcoal, and the first stars appeared, sharp and cold. Inside the cabin, Kate added more wood to the fire and lit another candle. She was not as scared as she had been the night before. The cabin felt safe now, protected. She knew that was probably foolish. She was still lost, still miles from home, still in danger, but something about this place made her feel held. Like Elizabeth's love had soaked into the walls and was still here, still offering shelter to a lost child who needed it. She ate a little more, drank more water, and then climbed into Elizabeth's bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The mattress was old and lumpy, but it was softer than the floor. She stared at the ceiling. watching shadows dance across the wooden beams. "Please let them find me tomorrow," she whispered. "Please let Dad be okay. Please tell my mom I love her." Sleep came slowly, but it came. Miles away in Pine Ridge, the search had resumed at first light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. Snowplows worked through the night to clear the roads, but the woods were impassable except on foot or snowmobile. David Morrison had not slept. He stood in his kitchen, staring at the map Sheriff Hayes had spread across the table, marking off the areas they had already searched. It was not enough. They needed to go deeper, farther, into places no one went anymore. The house was full of people, neighbors bringing coffee and food, volunteers from the church organizing shifts. Miss Miller sat in the corner, her face pale and drawn, barely holding herself together. David could not look at her. He knew it was not her fault, not really, but anger was easier than fear, and he needed something to hold on to. Sheriff Hayes put a hand on his shoulder. "We have got dogs coming in from Helena. Should be here within the hour. We are going to find her, David." David nodded but did not speak. What could he say? That he had been a terrible father? That he had been so consumed by his own pain, he had stopped seeing his daughter? That Kate had probably wandered off looking for something? Anything, to fill the emptiness he had created in their home? The guilt was crushing him, but he could not afford to break down. Not yet, not until Kate was home. The dogs arrived at 8 in the morning, 2 German shepherds trained in search and rescue. They were given one of Kate's shirts to scent, and they pulled hard on their leashes, eager to work. The handlers led them to the edge of the woods where Mrs. Miller said Kate had last been seen. The dogs circled, sniffed, and then took off, heading deeper into the forest with their handlers and a team of volunteers following. David was with them, moving as fast as he could through the deep snow. The morning was brutally cold, the sun bright but offering no warmth. His breath came in clouds. His legs ached, but he pushed forward, calling Kate's name over and over until his voice was raw. The dogs led them in one-way sweeping patterns, but the snow had covered so much. Scent trails were weak, confused by the storm. Hours passed. The teams radioed back and forth, comparing notes, adjusting their search grid. A helicopter flew overhead, equipped with thermal imaging, but the thick canopy of trees made it nearly impossible to see anything from above. By noon, they had covered miles of forest and found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Kate had ever been there. Back at the Morrison house, more people gathered. The local news had picked up the story. Reporters stood outside in the cold, filming segments about the missing girl, the devoted father, the small town holding vigil. Someone set up a prayer circle in the front yard. Someone else organized a candlelight gathering for that evening. The community was doing what communities do in crisis, coming together, offering hope, refusing to accept the worst. But as the second day wore on and the sun began to sink toward the horizon, that hope was getting harder to hold. Sheriff Hayes stood in the command center they had set up in the Morrison living room, looking at the maps, the reports, the statistics. A child Kate's age lost in these conditions for over 24 hours. The chances of survival dropped with every minute. He did not want to say it out loud, but everyone was thinking it. They might be looking for a body now, not a living girl. An old man named Frank Miller stood near the window, a retired logger who had worked these woods for 40 years. He squinted at the map, tracing his finger along a section of forest that had not been searched yet. Too far out, too remote. "There used to be a cabin out there," he said quietly, "way back near Willow Creek. I have not thought about it in years." Sheriff Hayes looked up. "A cabin? Occupied?" Frank shook his head. "Not for decades. Belonged to a woman, a school teacher, Beth something. Her husband went to Vietnam and never came back. She stayed out there waiting for him. Town tried to help her, but she would not leave. Eventually people stopped checking on her, figured she had moved away or passed on. That was back in the 70s. David turned sharply. "Why did no one mention this before?" Frank shrugged. "Like I said, I have not thought about it in 40 years. Nobody goes out that far anymore. The trails are overgrown. I am not even sure the cabin is still standing." "But it might be," David said, his voice tight with desperate hope. "If Kate found it, if she got inside." Sheriff Hayes was already on the radio, calling the search teams. redirecting them toward the area Frank described. It was a long shot, a cabin that might not even exist anymore, in a section of woods that was miles from where Kate was last seen. But it was something, a possibility, and right now possibilities were all they had. The teams mobilized, pushing deeper into the wilderness as darkness fell. They carried high-powered flashlights and emergency supplies, moving as fast as the terrain allowed. Frank went with them, trying to remember the way, pointing out landmarks that had been there decades ago. A lightning-struck oak, a boulder shaped like a bear, a frozen creek bed that led north toward the hills. David moved through the snow like a man possessed, driven by something beyond exhaustion or fear. He would find his daughter. He had to, because the alternative, the thought of Kate cold and alone and scared, the thought of losing her the way he had lost Anna, it would destroy him. It would be the end of everything. As they climbed a steep ridge, Frank stopped and pointed. "There," Mom said. "Down in that hollow. That is where the cabin was." Through the trees, in the last light of day, they saw it. A dark shape nestled among the pines, barely visible beneath the snow. A cabin, small and silent. And then smoke. A thin gray line rising from its chimney. David's heart stopped. Smoke. Someone was inside. Someone had a fire going. He started running, crashing through the snow, stumbling and falling and getting back up. The other searchers followed, shouting into their radios that they had found something. They reached the cabin just as full darkness fell. David took the porch steps two at a time and threw open the door. Inside, by the light of a small fire and a single candle, Kate sat at a wooden table, wrapped in a quilt, reading from an old leather journal. She looked up, her face streaked with tears and soot, her eyes wide with surprise and relief. "Dad?" David crossed the room in 3 strides, dropped to his knees, and pulled her into his arms so tightly she gasped. He buried his face in her hair, sobbing, his whole body shaking. "Oh God, Kate. Oh God, baby, I thought I lost you." Kate wrapped her thin arms around his neck and held on, crying too, all the fear and loneliness of the past 2 days pouring out. "I got lost, Dad. I am sorry, I got so lost." "I know, sweetheart, I know, but you are okay. You are safe now." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands cupping her face, checking for injuries, searching her eyes. "Are you hurt? Are you cold?" She shook her head. "I'm okay. The cabin kept me safe. Elizabeth kept me safe." David looked around, confused. Seeing the cabin for the first time, the fire in the hearth, the photographs on the mantel, the Christmas nativity scene, the journal open on the table. "Elizabeth?" Kate picked up the journal with trembling hands. "She lived here. She waited for her husband to come home from the war, but he never did. She died here, Dad, a long time ago, but her cabin saved me." The other searchers crowded into the doorway, relief washing over their faces. Sheriff Hayes radioed back to base that Kate had been found alive. The news spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire, and people who had been holding their breath for 2 days finally exhaled. Church bells rang, a joyful clamor that echoed off the mountains. Christmas lights that had seemed muted and sad for the past 2 days now blazed with genuine celebration. At the Morrison house, Mrs. Miller collapsed in her kitchen, crying tears of gratitude. David held Kate close, rocking her gently, whispering, "I am so sorry. I am sorry I have not been there. I am sorry I have been so lost in my own sadness. But that is over now. I promise you, Kate, that is over." Kate pressed her face against his shoulder, feeling something shift between them, something broken beginning to mend. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, baby. So much, more than anything in this world." They sat there together in the small cabin, while the search team documented the scene, while paramedics checked Kate's vitals, while Frank Miller stood in the doorway with tears in his eyes, remembering Elizabeth Sullivan and the love that had kept this place standing all these years. And in the flickering candlelight beside the ceramic nativity scene and the photographs of a soldier who never came home, a father and daughter found each other again, brought together by loss, by hope, and by a woman who died waiting but whose love had never stopped giving shelter to those who needed it most. The paramedics worked quickly but gently, checking Kate's temperature, her fingers and toes for frostbite, her eyes for signs of hypothermia. She sat wrapped in thermal blankets they had brought, her small frame nearly swallowed by the silver material. The cabin was crowded now with searchers, their breath fogging in the cold air, despite the fire still crackling in the hearth. Radio chatter filled the small space as teams coordinated the extraction. Word spread back to town that the miracle everyone had prayed for had actually happened. David never let go of Kate's hand. He knelt beside her, his eyes red from crying, his face etched with exhaustion and relief so profound it hurt to look at. One of the paramedics, a young woman named Sarah Thompson, smiled as she removed the blood pressure cuff from Kate's arm. "She is okay," she said softly. "A little dehydrated, slight drop in core temperature, but nothing serious. She is one tough kid." Kate looked up at her father. "I drank snow water. I boiled it in the kettle like you showed me that time we went camping." David's throat tightened. He had almost forgotten that camping trip. 2 summers ago, when Anna was still alive, they had spent a weekend in the mountains, teaching Kate how to build a fire, how to purify water, how to read the stars. He had thought at the time she was too young to remember much of it, but she had remembered. In the moment it mattered most, she had remembered. "You did good, sweetheart," he managed. "You did so good." Sheriff Hayes stood near the fireplace, his weathered face soft with emotion. He had seen a lot in his 30 years of law enforcement, but finding a lost child alive after 2 days in these conditions, it was the kind of miracle that made even cynical old cops believe in something bigger. He looked around the cabin, taking in the details, the preserved furniture, the photographs, the journal still open on the table. Frank Miller had been right. Elizabeth Sullivan's cabin had stood all these years, waiting. "We need to get her back to town," Sarah said. "She needs a proper examination at the clinic. Warm fluids, observation for at least 24 hours. David nodded but did not move. Kate tugged on his sleeve. "Dad, can we bring Elizabeth's journal? I promised I would tell her story. I promised I would make sure people know she was real." David looked at the leather-bound book, at his daughter's earnest face, and something shifted in him. For 2 years he had been trying to forget, to bury the past, to pretend that moving forward meant leaving everything behind. But Kate understood something he had lost sight of. Remembering was not the same as staying stuck. Honoring the past did not mean you could not build a future. "Yes," he said quietly, "we will bring it. We will tell her story." The journey back through the woods was slow and careful. They had brought a rescue sled to transport Kate, but she insisted on walking, at least for the first part. "I am not broken," she said with a stubbornness that made David smile despite everything. "I can walk." They compromised. She walked when the terrain was flat, rode the sled when it got steep or her legs got tired. David stayed beside her the whole time, one hand on her shoulder as if letting go might cause her to disappear again. The search teams formed a protective circle around them, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their relief palpable in the way they joked and called out to each other, the tension of the past 2 days finally breaking. Frank Miller walked near the back of the group, quiet and thoughtful. He kept looking back toward the cabin, invisible now in the darkness, but still there, still standing. He thought about Elizabeth Sullivan, about the young teacher he had known in passing all those years ago. She had been kind, he remembered. Always had a smile, always stopped to talk, even when folks got busy. After Robert went missing, she had changed, got quieter, more distant. People had tried to help, but grief builds walls, and eventually the town had let her fade into the background, into the woods, into memory. Now, 43 years after her death, she had saved a child's life. Her cabin, her preserved supplies, her stubborn refusal to leave. It had all mattered. It had all meant something. Frank wiped at his eyes, not caring who saw. Some stories deserved to be remembered. They emerged from the woods just after 9 at night. The parking area near the trailhead was packed with vehicles, their headlights creating a sea of light. News crews had set up, their cameras rolling. But Sheriff Hayes had called ahead, and his deputies formed a barrier, keeping the media back, creating a path to the waiting ambulance. Kate climbed in with David beside her. And they drove through town toward the small medical clinic on Main Street. Pine Ridge had transformed in their absence. Every house had its lights on. People stood on porches and sidewalks, holding candles, holding each other, watching the ambulance pass. When they saw it, when they knew Kate was inside and alive, they cheered. They cried. They called out blessings and thank gods and welcome homes. The church bells started ringing, a joyful clamor that echoed off the mountains. Christmas lights that had seemed muted and sad for the past 2 days now blazed with genuine celebration. At the clinic, Dr. Raymond Foster was waiting. He was a man in his late 60s with gentle hands and a grandfatherly manner that put even the most frightened children at ease. He had delivered Kate 8 years ago. He examined her thoroughly while David hovered nearby, answering questions about what she had eaten, what she had drunk, how she had stayed warm. The journal sat on the counter, and Dr. Foster glanced at it curiously but did not ask. Not yet. She is dehydrated, but not dangerously so, he said finally. No frostbite, no signs of hypothermia, some bruising on her legs from the terrain, and she is exhausted. But Kate, you are one lucky young lady. It was not luck, Kate said quietly. It was Elizabeth. Dr. Foster raised an eyebrow and looked at David for explanation. David picked up the journal and handed it to him. She found an old cabin in the woods. A woman named Elizabeth Sullivan lived there, died there back in the 70s. This is her journal. It tells her whole story. Dr. Foster opened it carefully, reading the first few lines, and his expression changed. Recognition, then sadness, then something like awe. Elizabeth Sullivan, he murmured. I remember her. She taught my daughter in second grade, back in 68 or 69. Lovely woman. After her husband went missing in Vietnam, she just disappeared. We all assumed she had moved away to be with family. She stayed, Kate said, in the cabin. She waited for him. She died waiting. The room fell silent. Dr. Foster read a few more entries, his eyes glistening. Finally, he closed the journal gently and handed it back. I think this town needs to hear this story, he said. I think we owe Elizabeth Sullivan more than we gave her. Word spread faster than seemed possible in a town of less than 3,000 people. By the time David and Kate left the clinic 2 hours later with instructions for rest and fluids and a follow-up appointment, half of Pine Ridge knew about Elizabeth Sullivan in the cabin that had saved Kate Morrison. The story resonated in a way David could not have predicted. Maybe it was the season, Christmas just days away, a time when people think about miracles and faith and love that endures. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe people just needed to believe that the things we do, the love we give, it does not end when we do. It ripples outward, touching lives we will never meet, changing the world in ways we will never see. Mrs. Miller was waiting at the Morrison house, her face blotchy from crying. When Kate walked through the door, she rushed forward and wrapped her in a hug so tight David had to gently intervene. I am so sorry, Mrs. Miller sobbed. I am so sorry, sweetheart. Kate hugged her back. It is okay, Mrs. Miller. I should not have wandered off. I know better. You are home. That is all that matters. You are home. The house was full of people again, but the energy was different now. Before it had been frantic, desperate. Now it was celebratory, grateful. Neighbors had brought casseroles and bees and gifts wrapped in bright paper. Someone had decorated the house while they were gone, putting up a tree in the corner with lights and ornaments, hanging a wreath on the door, stringing garland along the staircase. David stood in the doorway, overwhelmed. He had not wanted any of this. He had planned to let Christmas pass unmarked the way he had for the past 2 years. But Kate's eyes lit up when she saw the tree, and he realized he had been wrong about everything. That night, after the visitors had gone and the house finally quieted, David sat on the edge of Kate's bed while she lay tucked beneath her grandmother's quilt. She looked so small, so fragile, but he knew now that was an illusion. His daughter was strong, stronger than he had ever given her credit for. Tell me about Elizabeth, he said softly. Kate's eyes brightened, and she began to talk. She told him about the journal entries, about Elizabeth's love for Robert, about the cabin they had built together, about her stubborn hope that refused to die even when everything else did. She told him about the Christmas decorations, about the photographs, about the feeling she had in that cabin. Like she was not alone, like someone was watching over her. She loved him so much, Kate said, her voice thick with emotion. Even when everyone told her he was not coming back, she kept believing. Is that sort of beautiful? David thought about it, about Anna, about the way he had tried to stop loving her by pretending she had never existed, by packing away her things and refusing to speak her name. Both, he said finally. I think it is both. Love does not stop just because the person is gone, but we have to find a way to keep living anyway. Kate looked at him with those storm cloud eyes, so much like her mother's. You stopped living, Dad. After Mom died, you just stopped. The words hit him like a physical blow, but he did not flinch away from them. She was right. He had been a ghost in his own life, going through the motions but not really present, not really trying. I know, he whispered. I am sorry, Kate. I am so sorry. Are you going to start again? Living, I mean? David took her hand, holding it gently. Yes, I promise you, baby, I am going to train you. She smiled, a real smile, the first he had seen in months. Elizabeth would want that. She wrote in her journal that love is supposed to make you more alive, not less, even when it hurts. David leaned down and kissed her forehead. Then that is what we will do. We will be more alive, for your mom, for Elizabeth, for us. The next morning, David woke early and made a decision. He called Sheriff Hayes and asked about the cabin, about who owned the land, about what would happen to it now. The sheriff did some digging and discovered that the property had been in Elizabeth's name. But after she had been declared legally dead in 1985, it had reverted to the county. No one had ever claimed it, developed it, or even visited it as far as records showed. It had simply existed in bureaucratic limbo for 34 years, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. What are you thinking? Sheriff Hayes asked. I am thinking that place deserves better than being forgotten again, David said. I am thinking the town should know about Elizabeth, about what she did, about the hope that kept that cabin standing all these years. The sheriff was quiet for a moment. You want to make it a memorial? I want to make it matter. By afternoon, David had spoken with the county commissioner, with the Historical Society, with Dr. Foster and Frank Miller, and a dozen other people who remembered Elizabeth or had been touched by Kate's story. The response was mostly positive, overwhelmingly so. Yes, they said, absolutely yes. Elizabeth Sullivan deserved to be remembered. Her story deserved to be told. But not everyone agreed, and that was the reality David had to face. In the real world, good intentions met bureaucracy and budgets and differing opinions. The county commissioner, a man named Robert Williams, was skeptical. That is county land, he said. It would cost money to maintain a memorial. The budget is tight. I am not sure we can justify it. Some townspeople questioned the idea as well. At the next town meeting, a woman named Patricia Henderson stood up. Elizabeth Sullivan was a good teacher, she said, but she abandoned her students, left mid-year. The children were confused, hurt. I am not sure that deserves celebration. Another man, Thomas Blake, added his voice. She chose to isolate herself. She gave up on life. Why should we memorialize that? We have real problems in this town. Why focus on the past? David sat in the audience, listening, feeling his hope deflate. He had thought this would be simple, that everyone would see what he saw. But people were complicated, and grief made them even more so. Kate was beside him, and she heard it all. After the meeting, as they walked to the truck, she was quiet, unusually so. Dad, she said finally, are we going to lose the cabin? David did not answer right away, because he did not know. That night, Kate did something that surprised him. She sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper, and she wrote. She wrote for 2 hours, crossing things out, starting over, her tongue sticking out the way it did when she was concentrating hard. Sometimes she would stop and stare at the ceiling, searching for the right words. Finally, she looked up at David. Will you help me? She asked. I know what I want to say, but I do not know how to say it right. David sat down beside her, and together they worked, not changing her meaning, not putting adult words in a child's mouth, just helping her find the clearest way to express what she felt. She would say something and he would nod or suggest a different word. They crossed out entire paragraphs and rewrote them. They argued about whether to include certain details. They laughed when Kate insisted on a phrase that was perfectly, stubbornly her own. When they finished, it was past midnight. Kate's eyes were heavy, but she looked at the letter with satisfaction. "Can we send this to the newspaper?" she asked. David read it one more time, and by the time he finished, there were tears in his eyes. "Yes," he said, "we can send it." The letter was published in the Pine Ridge Gazette 2 days later. On December 26th, it read, "My name is Kate Morrison, and I am 80 years old. I got lost in the woods on December 22nd, and I found a cabin. That cabin saved my life. It belonged to a woman named Elizabeth Sullivan, who died there 43 years ago. She was waiting for her husband Robert to come home from Vietnam. He never did. But she never stopped waiting. She never stopped loving him. And because she kept that cabin so carefully, because she left the wood and the food and the hope, I am alive today, Mrs." Henderson said Elizabeth abandoned her students. But I do not think that is true. I think she was so sad she did not know how to keep going. I think she did the best she could. My mom died 2 years ago, and sometimes I am so sad I do not want to get out of bed. Sometimes I do not want to talk or eat or do anything. Does that mean I am giving up on life? Or does it mean I am just trying to survive? Elizabeth survived for 7 years after Robert disappeared. 7 years of waiting and hoping and believing. That is not giving up. That is holding on so hard your hands bleed. If we forget her now, we are saying her waiting did not matter. We are saying her promise did not matter. We are saying she did not matter. But she did, she does, and I am alive because of her. Please do not let her be forgotten again. The letter went viral, first locally, then regionally, then nationally. People magazine picked it up. Good Morning America wanted an interview. Suddenly, Kate Morrison was the face of a story that touched something deep in people. The idea that love could reach across decades to save a life. But with attention came complications. The county was flooded with calls. Donations started coming in, small amounts at first, $10 here, $20 there, then larger amounts. A woman in California sent $500 with a note. "My husband died in Vietnam. I understand, Elizabeth." A veterans organization in Texas sent $1,000 for the ones who waited at home. Within a week, they had raised $15,000. The county commissioner called a special meeting. The room was packed, standing room only. David and Kate sat in the front row. Kate held Elizabeth's journal in her lap. Commissioner Williams stood at the podium. "We have received a lot of attention regarding the Sullivan property," he said, "and a lot of donations. The question before us is simple. Do we move forward with creating a memorial, or do we return the donations and let the cabin continue as it has for the past 4 decades? Patricia Henderson stood again. "I still have concerns. This sets a precedent. What about other properties? Other stories? Where do we draw the line?" But then someone else stood, a woman David did not recognize. She was in her 60s, gray hair pulled back, eyes red from crying. "My name is Margaret Sullivan," she said. "Elizabeth was my aunt. I was 12 when she died. My parents tried to get her to leave that cabin, to come live with us, but she would not. She said Robert would not know where to find her if she left. I was angry at her for a long time, angry that she chose a dead man over her living family. But now, hearing this little girl's story, I understand. Elizabeth was not choosing death. She was choosing faith. She was choosing to believe in something bigger than what we could see. And that faith saved a child. How can we not honor that?" The room was silent. Then another person stood, and another. Former students of Elizabeth's, people who remembered her kindness, her patience, her belief that every child mattered. An old man in the back stood, his voice shaking. "I was in Vietnam, came home in '71. I remember hearing about guys whose wives or girlfriends waited, and guys whose women moved on. Both choices were hard, both were valid. But the ones who waited, they gave us something to hold on to, something to fight for. Elizabeth Sullivan waited 7 years. She deserves to be remembered." When the vote came, it was unanimous. The memorial would move forward. But that was just the beginning. The real work came next. They formed a committee, led by Dr. Foster and Frank Miller, With input from the Historical Society and the county, they secured additional funding through grants and donations. A local construction company volunteered to create a safe, accessible trail to the cabin. An electrician offered to install subtle lighting that would not disturb the historical integrity, but would allow evening visits. A publisher in Helena expressed interest in printing Elizabeth's journal, with all proceeds going to a scholarship fund they would establish in her name. But the most touching response came from the people who had known Elizabeth. Former students, now in their 50s and 60s, came forward with stories, photographs, letters she had written them. A woman named Linda Martinez brought a watercolor painting Elizabeth had done of the Pine Ridge schoolhouse. A man named James Peterson shared that Elizabeth had paid for his school supplies one year when his family could not afford them, never asking for repayment, never making him feel ashamed. Another former student, now a librarian in Billings, donated money specifically to create a reading nook in the cabin. She said Elizabeth had taught her to love books and that devotion had shaped her entire life. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had given everything to others, who had loved teaching with a passion that transformed lives, who had married her high school sweetheart and built a life full of promise. And when that promise was broken, when Robert went missing in the jungles of Vietnam in the summer of 1969, she had retreated to the cabin they had built together and refused to accept a world without him in it. Some people called it tragic. David called it faithful. Kate called it the most romantic and saddest story she had ever heard. All of them were right. In early January, a journalist from the Helena Independent Record came to interview Kate. She sat in the Morrison living room, now decorated with photographs from the cabin, and told Elizabeth's story with a clarity that left the reporter in tears. The article ran on the front page a week later. Lost girl finds cabin and uncovers 40-year love story. It was picked up by the Associated Press. Within days, national news outlets were calling. David was overwhelmed by the attention, but Kate handled it with remarkable grace. She gave interviews, but kept them focused on Elizabeth, not herself. "This is not about me getting lost," she told one reporter. "It is about Elizabeth being found. It is about making sure her story does not end in silence. She deserves better than that." The scholarship fund grew beyond anyone's expectations. Within 2 months, they had enough money to fund 4 full scholarships annually for students pursuing teaching degrees. The first scholarship was awarded in March to a young woman named Sarah Williams, Margaret Sullivan's granddaughter, who had been inspired by Elizabeth's story to become a teacher herself. At the award ceremony, she said, "I never met Mrs. Sullivan, but her dedication to teaching reached me anyway. That is the kind of teacher I want to be." As winter softened into spring, the memorial project gained momentum. Local high school students joined the effort, interviewing former students of Elizabeth's for an oral history project. A filmmaker from Missoula approached the committee about creating a documentary. The State Historical Society designated the cabin as an official landmark. Each development felt like Elizabeth's story reaching further, touching more lives, proving something David was only beginning to understand, that the things we leave behind matter more than we know. One particularly moving moment came in April when a veteran named Douglas McCarthy traveled from Oregon to visit the cabin. He was 74 years old now, his face weathered and scarred, but his eyes filled with tears as he stood in the cabin Elizabeth had kept waiting. "I was with Robert the day he went missing," Douglas said, his voice breaking. "August 15th, 1969. We were on patrol near the DMZ. Ambush, chaos. Robert and 2 others got separated. We searched for 3 days, never found them. Robert made me promise. If anything happened to him, I would check on Beth, make sure she was okay. But by the time I got home, got myself together, tracked her down, she was already gone. I have carried that guilt for 50 years. Thank you for giving her the honor we should have given her then." Kate hugged him, this old soldier who had carried his own burden of grief and promises unkept. "You are here now," she said simply. "That still matters." Douglas donated his entire collection of letters from Robert, written from Vietnam. They became some of the most treasured artifacts in the memorial, showing a young man thinking about his wife, his dreams for their future, his fear and courage. Reading them, visitors understood why Elizabeth had waited. The cabin restoration began in March when the snow finally melted enough to allow access. David took a week off work to volunteer. along with dozens of others. They worked carefully, reverently, under the guidance of a historical preservation expert from the state university. Every piece of wood replaced was documented, every artifact cataloged and preserved. They reinforced the structure without changing its character. They cleaned without erasing the patina of time. They honored what Elizabeth and Robert had built. Kate was there every day after school, helping in whatever way she could. She swept floors, organized artifacts, painted display boards with information about Elizabeth's life. She had become the unofficial historian of the project, the keeper of Elizabeth's story, and she took the responsibility seriously. Other students from Pine Ridge Elementary came to help too, learning about history in a way no textbook could teach. The garden Kate had envisioned began to take shape in April. Using Elizabeth's journal entries about the flowers she had planted, volunteers recreated her garden. Purple irises, yellow daffodils, pink climbing roses on a trellis Robert had built. A local master gardener donated her time, ensuring every plant was period appropriate, every placement intentional. When the first flowers bloomed in May, people wept. It was like Elizabeth's hands were there again, coaxing beauty from the earth, refusing to let hope die, even in the darkest times. In June, on what would have been Elizabeth and Robert's 52nd wedding anniversary, the memorial officially opened. More than 1,000 people attended the ceremony, filling the hollow around the cabin, spilling out into the woods. A local sculptor had created a bronze plaque that they mounted beside the door. It read, Elizabeth Ann Sullivan, 1944 to 1976, teacher, wife, and keeper of promises. Her faith preserved this place. Her story inspires us all. Kate read from the journal during the ceremony, her voice strong and clear. She read about Elizabeth building the cabin with Robert, about choosing to wait, about refusing to give up hope. She read the final entry, the one about dying but not regretting, about leaving everything there for him. There was not a dry eye in the crowd. David stood beside his daughter, holding the original journal in a protective case that would be displayed inside the cabin. He thought about how much had changed in 6 months, how Kate had gone from a quiet, withdrawn child to someone who could stand in front of 1,000 people and tell a story that mattered, how he had gone from a man barely surviving to a father who was learning to live again. After the ceremony, people filed through the cabin in small groups, reading the displays, looking at the artifacts, sitting in the chairs where Elizabeth had once sat. Many left notes in a visitor's book, sharing their own stories. A Vietnam veteran wrote, "Thank you for remembering the ones who did not come home and the ones who waited for them." A widow wrote, "Some promises are worth keeping, even when they break you." A young couple wrote, "We are getting married next month. This place reminds us what marriage means." A teacher wrote, "After 40 years, I finally remember why I started." Kate had created a special display in one corner, her letter to the newspaper, framed and mounted on the wall, along with photographs of the cabin during the rescue and her own account of the 2 days she had spent there. Beneath it, a small sign read, "Sometimes getting lost is how we find what matters most." That evening, after the crowds had gone and the sun was setting, David and Kate stayed behind. They walked to the edge of the hollow and sat on a fallen log. Looking back at the cabin, it glowed in the golden light, smoke rising gently from the chimney where a small ceremonial fire had been lit. It looked alive, purposeful, waiting for the next person who needed shelter. Kate leaned against her father's shoulder. "I still miss Mom so much." David put his arm around her. "I know, baby, I do too. But I think we are learning how to carry it. Not by pretending it does not hurt, but by remembering what she taught us." Kate was quiet for a moment. What did she teach us? David thought about Anna, about the way she had loved Christmas, about her belief that hope was a choice you made every morning, about how she had never given up on him, even when he had given up on himself. That the world needs people who refuse to stop hoping, he said, even when it seems foolish, even when it hurts. Your mom was like that. Elizabeth was like that. And now you are too. Kate smiled. So are you, Dad. As the stars began to appear overhead, Kate asked the question David knew was coming eventually. "Dad, what happened to Robert? Did they ever find him?" David had done research on this, had spoken with military historians, with Douglas McCarthy, with people who knew the story. Yes, he said. In 2007, 38 years after he went missing, a joint recovery team found remains in Vietnam. They were positively identified as Robert Sullivan through DNA testing. He was brought home, buried in the Pine Ridge Cemetery with full military honors. Margaret Sullivan made sure Elizabeth's name was added to his headstone. It says, "Beloved wife who waited faithfully." Kate was quiet, processing this. So they are together now? Yes, finally. Did Elizabeth ever know before she died? David shook his head. No, she died in 76. His remains were not found until 2007. She never knew what happened to him. Never had closure. Kate thought about this for a long moment. Maybe that is sadder. Or maybe it is better. She got to keep believing. She got to keep hoping. She never had to accept that he was really gone. David pulled her closer. Maybe. Or maybe it does not matter. Maybe what matters is that she chose to wait. And that choice, that decision to keep hoping, it saved your life 43 years later. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. The cabin stood watch below them, no longer forgotten, no longer silent. It had become something more than wood and stone, a place where people came to remember, to grieve, to hope, to understand that the promises we make matter more than we know. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, David and Kate returned to the cabin with Sheriff Hayes, Dr. Foster, Frank Miller, Mrs. Miller, and a small group of others who had been part of the journey. They lit candles, sang carols, shared stories of the year that had passed. Kate placed a wreath on the door, the same kind of wreath Elizabeth had written about making. David read from the journal, the entry about Christmas being the time when the world remembers how to hope. When it was time to leave, Kate hung a new ornament on the small tree they had set up inside the cabin. It was handmade, a ceramic heart with words painted in gold. For Elizabeth and Robert, together at last, Kate, David, and Anna Morrison. As they walked back through the snow-covered woods toward town, David put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For reminding me that living is what we owe the people we have lost. Not suffering, living." Kate squeezed his hand. "Elizabeth taught me that, and you taught me too. Just took you a while to remember." David laughed, a real laugh, the first in years. "Stubborn like your mother." "Good." Behind them, the cabin stood silent and strong, its windows glowing with candlelight, its chimneys sending smoke spiraling into the winter sky. Inside, Elizabeth's journal lay open to the entry about choosing to feel everything, about refusing to play it safe, about believing that tomorrow might be the day everything changes. And on the wall, Kate's letter remained, not as a monument to tragedy, but as proof that sometimes the things we build in hope will shelter people we will never meet, that the promises we keep matter, that waiting for someone is not the same as giving up on life. It is simply another way of loving. The story of Elizabeth Sullivan and Kate Morrison became part of Pine Ridge. Not legend, not myth, just a true thing that happened. The cabin became a place people visited, especially in winter, especially when life felt impossible. They would sit in the quiet, read the journal, look at the photographs, and leave understanding something they had not understood before. Years passed, Kate grew up, went to college, became a teacher like Elizabeth. Every December 22nd, she brought her third-grade class to the cabin. They would sit in a circle on the floor while she told them the story of how she got lost in the woods, how she found a cabin that should not have existed, how a woman she never met saved her life. And every year, without fail, a student would ask the same question. "But was it worth it, Miss Morrison? All that waiting? Elizabeth never saw Robert again. She died alone. Was it worth it?" Kate would smile. She was 52 years old now, her hair touched with gray. Her father had passed 3 years ago, peaceful, in his sleep. The cabin had been there for his memorial service, just like it had been there for her wedding, for the birth of her children, for every important moment of her life. She would smile and say, "Let me tell you what I know. When I was 8 years old, I was dying in the woods, and Elizabeth Sullivan, who had been dead for 43 years, saved my life. Her wood kept me warm. Her food kept me alive. Her story gave me hope. She built that cabin for Robert, but she also built it for me, for every person who needed shelter, for everyone who ever got lost and needed to find their way home. So you tell me, was it worth it? The students would think about that, and eventually someone would say, yes, it was worth it. Kate would nod. Elizabeth would agree. On quiet afternoons, you can still see visitors at the cabin, sitting on the porch, reading Elizabeth's words, running their fingers over the photographs, understanding, perhaps for the first time, what it means to make a promise and keep it, to wait, to hope, to build something that will outlast you. The cabin still stands, strong and solid, waiting for the next person who needs it, just like Elizabeth always wanted, just like she always believed it would. And if you listen carefully on winter nights, when the wind moves through the pines, some people swear they can hear it. Not ghosts, not spirits, just the sound of a place that was built with care, maintained with devotion, and preserved by a woman who understood something most of us forget, that the things we do out of love never really end. They just wait for the right moment to matter.